The imperial decree had been very specific. I was to marry General Feng Wei, the Iron Wolf of the North, to settle my father's gambling debts to the crown. The wedding was a sea of crimson silk, gold leaf, and enough incense to choke a celestial dragon. According to tradition, a bride of the Qin Dynasty should be a silent shadow, a willow in the wind, a mute ornament of her husband's household. My mother had spent 3 days praying to the ancestors that I wouldn't open my mouth. She even suggested I suck on a dried plum stone during the ceremony to keep my tongue occupied. I had spat it out 10 minutes ago. It was a choking hazard, and I refused to be the first bride in history to die of a stone-induced asphyxiation before the vows were finished. As we knelt before the emperor in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. The silence was so profound you could hear a cricket sneeze 3 provinces away. The general sat beside me, a mountain of black silk and cold, radiating authority. He smelled of sandalwood, expensive ink, and the faint metallic scent of a man who spent more time with his sword than with people. He hadn't looked at me once. The union of the dragon and the phoenix is sealed, the high priest intoned, his voice echoing off the rafters. I shifted. My knees were starting to ache, and the phoenix crown on my head weighed more than a small child. The beads of my red veil swayed, obscuring my vision, but I could see the general's profile. A jawline carved from granite and eyes that seemed to be scanning the room for assassins rather than admiring his new wife. "You know," I whispered, the sound cutting through the sacred silence like a butcher's knife through fresh tofu. "If you're planning on keeping this scowl on your face for the entire marriage, we're going to need to invest in more facial oils. You're only 30, General, but your forehead looks like a topographical map of the northern wastelands. It's very distracting." I heard a collective gasp from the court officials. My father, 3 rows back, let out a sound like a dying flute. Feng Wei didn't move. He didn't even blink. But I saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. A tiny rhythmic pulse of irritation. "Silence is a virtue in a wife, Lady Lin Xiaolan," he rumbled. His voice was like grinding stones, deep and dangerous. "So is honesty." I snapped back, leaning slightly toward him so the jade beads on my veil clinked against his armored shoulder. "And honestly, this ceremonial wine tastes like fermented socks. If we're going to be tied together for the rest of our lives, I hope your personal cellar is better than the emperor's. Also, your sword hilt is poking me in the ribs. Is it happy to see me, or are you just trying to perform an impromptu appendectomy in front of the Son of Heaven?" The emperor actually dropped his jade scepter. It clattered down the marble steps with a hollow thump thump thump. The general slowly turned his head. Up close, behind the curtain of my red silk, I could see his eyes. They were obsidian, sharp enough to draw blood, and currently narrowed in something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't quite peace either. Most people fainted when he looked at them like this. I just adjusted my sleeve. "You have a very busy mouth," he noted. "It's a family trait." I lied. "My father says I was born talking and only paused once at age 4 to eat a particularly large dumpling. I've been making up for lost time ever since." He stared at me for a long beat. The court held its breath, expecting him to draw his blade and end the shortest marriage in the history of the empire. Instead, he stood up, his massive hand reaching down to haul me to my feet with effortless, terrifying strength. "The ceremony is over," Feng Wei announced to the shocked emperor. "I am taking my wife home before she insults the ancestors into rising from their graves." As he led me out, practically dragging me by the hand while my heavy robes trailed behind us, I didn't stop. Oh, thank the gods. My legs were falling asleep. "By the way, does your horse have a name? If it's something boring like Shadow or Thunder, I'm renaming it Puffball. It creates a much better psychological advantage for your enemies." The general's grip on my hand didn't loosen, but for the briefest second, I felt a huff of warm air against my ear. "It is Thunder," he muttered. "And if you call it Puffball in front of my men, I will put you in a sack." "A silk sack?" I asked hopefully. "The burlap is so itchy." He didn't answer, but as we stepped into the sunlight, I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. I wasn't buried yet, and the game had just begun.
Welcome to Comic Love Story Channel. Subscribe for more chaotic moments.
Chapter 1. The carriage ride to the northern border felt less like a wedding procession and more like a prisoner transfer. Outside, the wind howled across the lush plateau, kicking up dust that managed to find its way through every crack in the lacquered wood. Inside, I sat opposite General Feng Wei, who had spent the last 3 hours practicing the art of becoming a statue, that I'd tried counting the number of rivets in his armor, but I got bored at 42. I tried humming, but he'd looked at me with an expression that suggested he was considering using my tongue as a bookmark. Naturally, that only made me want to talk more. You know, I said, breaking the silence for the 58th time, there is a specific type of meditation where one breathes through the nose to achieve inner peace. But if you keep holding your breath like that, your head is eventually going to pop off and roll under the seat. It would be a very messy start to our marriage, and I didn't bring enough handkerchiefs to clean up a decapitated general. Feng Wei's eyes remained closed. His arms were crossed over his chest, his fingers resting motionless against the dark silk of his sleeves. The journey is long, Xiulan, he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards. Sleep. It is the only way you will find silence. I can't sleep. My brain is like a cage full of squirrels on rice wine. I leaned forward, the gold pins in my hair jingling. And besides, we're arriving. I can see the black banners. Is it true you hang the ears of your enemies from the rafters? Because I have a very sensitive nose, and if the foyer smells like rotting cartilage, I'm going to have to insist on burning an offensive amount of jasmine incense. Also, who picked these banners? Black on dark gray? It's very brooding, villain. We should consider a nice teal. The carriage lurched to a halt. The general opened his eyes. They were obsidian, reflecting nothing but my own wide-eyed expression. He didn't answer me. He simply stood, ducking his head to avoid the low ceiling, and stepped out into the biting cold. When he handed me down, his hand was massive, swallowing mine completely. We stood before the gates of the Iron Wolf Fortress. It wasn't a palace. It was a beast of gray stone and sharpened timber. Standing in 2 perfect rows were his elite guards, men who looked like they had been forged in a furnace and quenched in vinegar. Welcome home, General. They roared in unison, a sound so loud it made my teeth rattle that I looked at the nearest soldier. He had a scar running from his eye to his chin, and looked about as friendly as a cornered cobra. Is that how you greet everyone? I asked, raising my voice to be heard over the wind. It's a bit aggressive, isn't it? If the vegetable monger comes by, do you scream at his cabbages too? It's a wonder you haven't caused a local landslide with all that shouting. And you, with the scar, are you scowling at me? Or is your face just stuck like that because of the wind? The soldier froze. His eyes darted to the general, then back to me, blinking in sheer confusion. No one spoke to the Iron Wolf's guard this way. This is the Lady Lin Xiulan, Feng Wei announced, his voice carrying effortlessly. She is the new mistress of this fortress. You will accord her the same respect you show me. Even if I tell you that your formations look a bit lopsided. I added, squinting at the line of men. The third man from the left is leaning. Is it a hip injury, or did he just have a very heavy lunch? Honestly, if the barbarians attack, they'll just trip over your lack of symmetry. The soldier in question turned bright red, his posture snapping upright so fast his armor clanked. Xiulan, the general muttered, his hand finding the small of my back and ushering me toward the inner sanctum. The men are not here for your amusement. Everything is here for my amusement if I try hard enough. I countered, tripping slightly over the high threshold of the main hall. Oh gods. General, this decor is minimalist. And by minimalist, I mean it looks like a cave where Joy went to die. Do you have a thing against furniture? Or color? Or things that don't have sharp edges? He stopped in the center of the hall. The walls were hung with maps and weapons. There wasn't a single silk screen or flower vase in sight. It is a military outpost, he said, turning to face me. Not a scholar's garden in the capital. Clearly, I said, walking over to a particularly large, wicked-looking halberd mounted on the wall. I poked it. I'm just saying, a few cushions wouldn't kill the men. Unless the cushions were poisoned. Which, given the way your cook is looking at me from the kitchen doorway, might be a legitimate concern. Feng Wei stepped closer. He was so large he blotted out the light from the hearth. The tension between us was a physical thing. A cord stretched to the snapping point. My men think you are a fox spirit sent to distract me, he whispered, leaning down so his breath stirred the hair at my temple. They think that within a month, I will have to bury you because you cannot hold your tongue. I looked up at him, my heart doing a strange, fluttering dance that I chose to blame on the altitude. Well then, I suppose I'll have to keep talking just to prove them wrong. It would be a shame to die with so many insults still left in the tank. Besides, General, if you buried me, who would tell you that your armor smells like a wet horse? His eyes dropped to my lips for a fraction of a second. The first sign of a crack in his armor. You are a dangerous woman, Xiulan. And you have a very dusty mantle, General. We all have our flaws. Chapter 2. The sun had barely begun to crawl over the jagged peaks of the northern mountains when the sound of clashing steel woke me. It was rhythmic, brutal, and entirely too early for anyone who valued their sanity. I crawled out from under a mountain of heavy furs. The general's bed was as hard as a slab of tombstone, and threw on a robe of embroidered plum silk. If I was going to be awake at this ungodly hour, I was at least going to be the most colorful thing in this monochrome fortress. That I made my way to the balcony overlooking the training grounds. Below, 100 men were moving in perfect unison, their bare torsos glistening with sweat despite the frost. At the center stood Feng Wei. He wasn't wearing his armor. He was clad only in simple black trousers, wielding a heavy training saber. He looked less like a man and more like a force of nature, fluid, terrifying, and distractingly well-built. You're doing it all wrong, I shouted, leaning over the stone railing. The rhythmic clink-clank of swords stopped instantly. 100 pairs of eyes looked up. Feng Wei froze mid-swing, his saber inches from a younger soldier's throat. Lady Lin, the general said, his voice carrying a warning that would have silenced a tiger. It is dawn. Why are you not sleeping? How am I supposed to sleep with all this grunting? It sounds like a pig farm during mating season down here, I replied, waving a hand dismissively. And that boy you're fighting, Captain Zhao, is it? He's telegraphing his left strike, so clearly he might as well send a messenger pigeon to his opponent first. Dear enemy, I shall be hitting you on the shoulder in 3 seconds. Please prepare accordingly. Warm regards, Zhao. The young captain turned a shade of crimson that nearly matched my robe. I am not, my lady, he stammered. Oh, hush, you are, I said, descending the stairs into the courtyard. The soldiers parted from me like I was a plague bearer. I walked right up to the general, who was now looming over me, his chest heaving slightly from exertion. Up close, the heat radiating off him was enough to melt a glacier. And you, General, you're too stiff. You move like you're afraid you might accidentally enjoy yourself. Is there a tax on smiling in the north? Or does it just hurt your face? Xiulan, Feng Wei growled, his eyes darkening. This is a place of war, not a tea house. Everything is a tea house if you have the right attitude, I said, reaching out. Before he could flinch, I adjusted the grip on his saber, my fingers brushing against his warm, calloused hand. The contact sent a jolt up my arm that felt suspiciously like a lightning strike. I ignored it. Your thumb is too high. If you hit a shield like that, you'll sprain your wrist, and then who's going to carry my luggage when I decide this fortress is too depressing and we need to go on a retreat? The silence that followed was so heavy I thought the sky might fall. The soldiers looked like they were waiting for the general to snap me in half. Instead, Feng Wei looked down at his hand, then at me. His gaze was intense, prowling over my face as if trying to decode a language he had never heard. You think you can teach the god of war how to hold a blade? I think the god of war hasn't had anyone tell him no in 10 years, I countered, stepping closer into his personal space. I could smell the salt and the cold air on his skin. It's made you lazy. You're bored, Feng Wei. You're so bored you've forgotten that a fight should have a little flair. Flair, he repeated, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. Yes, like this. I reached out and flicked the red tassel on the hilt of his sword. It's dusty. A man of your standing should have a tassel that screams, I am wealthy enough to kill you. This one just screams, I found this in a horse's mane. One of the soldiers let out a muffled snort. Feng Wei's head snapped toward his men, and the laughter died instantly. He turned back to me, his jaw set. If you are so concerned with my flair, perhaps you should oversee the equipment inspections, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre. Since you have so much to say about things you do not understand. Oh, I understand plenty, I said, tilting my head back to meet his gaze. I understand that you're using this training as an excuse to avoid talking to me. But guess what, General? I can talk while you're swinging that sword. I can talk while you're eating. I can even talk while you're brooding in your dark study. You married a talker. You might as well surrender now. The siege is already over. Feng Wei stepped so close our chests almost touched. He leaned down, his lips inches from my ear. A siege ends when the gates are broken, Xiulan. My gates are still very much intact. We'll see. I whispered back, my heart thudding against my ribs. I've always been very good at finding the back door. He stared at me for a long moment, a strange, flickering light in his eyes. Then he turned to his men. Back to work. And someone find Captain Zhao a messenger pigeon. Apparently he needs one. As I walked away, I could feel his eyes on my back. I might not have broken his gates yet, but I'd definitely loosened a few stones. Chapter 3. If the training grounds were the general's heart, his study was his soul, which meant it was predictably dark, smelled of old parchment, and was organized with the terrifying precision of a funeral pyre. Naturally, I decided it needed a woman's touch. Or at least, a woman's tendency to move things until they looked less like a battle plan, and more like a room where a human might actually enjoy a cup of tea, that I spent the morning liberating the windows from their heavy charcoal drapes. When the light finally hit the room, it revealed a layer of dust so thick I'm surprised the general hadn't choked to death on his own military strategy. By the ancestors, I muttered, waving a silk handkerchief at the air. He isn't a general, he's a tombkeeper. If I find a mummified servant in the corner, I'm moving back to the capital. I began reorganizing his scrolls. He had them sorted by imminent threats, past conquests, and logistics. I decided a better system would be boring, very boring. And why is this even here? I was halfway through moving a heavy jade paperweight when a floorboard groaned behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know the air had just dropped 10 degrees. I don't recall giving you the keys to this room, Xiulan, the general's voice rumbled. He was standing in the doorway, his silhouette blocking out the very light I had worked so hard to let in. The lock was sticky, I said, not missing a beat as I stacked a pile of maps about the northern steppes into a neat pyramid. I considered it a cry for help. Really, Feng Wei, you have maps in here from the previous dynasty. Unless you're planning on time traveling to fight the barbarians' grandfathers, they're just taking up space. Also, I found a dead spider in your inkwell. I've named him General Eightlegs. He was a better conversationalist than you were at breakfast. Feng Wei walked into the room, his boots heavy on the wood. He looked at the bright sunlight, then at the rearranged scrolls. He looked like a man watching his favorite fortress get dismantled by a single, very talkative squirrel. These papers are sensitive, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. They contain the movements of the border patrols. If the wrong person saw them, the wrong person would fall asleep before they found the troop count, I interrupted, turning to face him. I was holding a small, weathered wooden box I'd found tucked behind a stack of tax ledgers. Speaking of sensitive, what's in here? It doesn't smell like military secrets. It smells like dried plum blossoms. The change in his demeanor was instantaneous. The general, a man who could face an army of 10,000 without flinching, actually took a step forward with a look of genuine alarm. Give that to me, he commanded. Oh, a secret. I held the box behind my back, ducking as he reached for it. For a man his size, he was fast, but I had spent my childhood running away from tutors who wanted to sew my mouth shut. I was nimble. Is it a love letter? Did the Iron Wolf have a puppy love? Did a girl in the village once tell you your scowl was handsome, and you kept her hair ribbon? Xiulan, I am not joking. Hand it over. Make me, I challenged, backing into his desk that he didn't lung. He moved slowly, prowling toward me until I was pinned between the edge of the heavy mahogany desk and the wall of his chest. He placed a hand on either side of me, trapping me in a cage of silk and muscle. The scent of sandalwood and something sharper, ink and iron, wrapped around me. My heart started thumping a rhythm that definitely wasn't in the military manual. You have a habit of poking things that bite, he whispered, his face so close I could see the golden flecks in his dark eyes. And you have a habit of biting things that poke, I retorted, though my voice was a little breathier than I intended. What's in the box, Feng Wei? Why does the god of war keep a box of flowers? He sighed, a sound of profound defeat, and leaned his forehead against mine for a fleeting second. It isn't flowers. It's poetry. My grandfather's. He was a scholar before the wars began. He taught me that a man who only knows how to destroy is not a man at all, but a weapon. I keep them to remind myself that I am not a sword. I went still. The humor drained out of me, replaced by a warmth that was far more dangerous than his anger. I slowly brought the box around and placed it in his hand. "Well," I said softly, my thumb grazing his knuckles. "You should have told me. I would have put them in the important pile. Although, if you're a secret poet, we're going to have a serious problem." "And why is that?" he asked, his gaze dropping to my mouth. "Because," I whispered, "I'll never get a word in edgewise if you start rhyming. And we both know there's only room for one loudmouth in this marriage." The general didn't pull away. He looked at the box, then back at me, and for the first time, the Iron Wolf looked like he was the one being hunted. Chapter for the arrival of Imperial Envoy Chow was announced with the fanfare of a dozen trumpets and enough self-importance to sink a junk boat. He was a man with a mustache that looked like two frightened caterpillars and a penchant for reciting the emperor's greatness as if he'd personally invented the sun. "Remember," Feng Wei whispered to me as we stood at the fortress gates, his hand a firm, warning weight on my shoulder. "For the next 3 hours, you are a portrait of silent devotion. No critiques of the architecture. No mentions of fermented socks. If you speak, the envoy reports to the emperor that I cannot control my own household. Do you understand?" I looked up at him, fluttering my lashes with an innocence that I knew made his skin crawl. "General, I am a willow. I am a compound. I am a stone that has taken a vow of mutiny. I mean mutinous." "Xiulan," he warned. "I'll be good," I hissed as the carriage door opened. Envoy Chow stepped out, smelling of cheap musk and expensive arrogance. He bowed to Feng Wei with the bare minimum of effort, and turned his squinting gaze toward me. "And this is the daughter of the Lin house? I heard she was spirited." I bowed low, pressing my lips together so hard they turned white. I managed a soft, submissive hum that sounded like a bee with a head cold. "She has taken a vow of silence to pray for the general's success in the border skirmishes." Feng Wei lied smoothly, his voice as steady as a mountain. I shot him a look that promised a very loud retribution later. The banquet was an exercise in slow-motion torture. Envoy Chow spent an hour detailing the exquisite refinements of the capital, subtly insulting the crude conditions of the north. I sat beside Feng Wei, pouring tea with trembling hands, not from nerves, but from the sheer, volcanic pressure of the 300 insults currently backing up in my throat. "And of course," Chow sneered, poking at a piece of braised venison, "the culinary arts here are functional. One misses the delicate bird's nest soup of the southern palace. This tastes like it was seasoned with a blacksmith's apron." Feng Wei's jaw tightened. He was a man of the north, he loved this land. I felt his hand clench under the table. That was it. My willow snapped. "It's funny you should mention the southern palace, envoy," I said, my voice ringing out like a silver bell in the silent hall. Feng Wei's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with a mix of horror. "And I told you so." "I thought the lady was silent," Chow barked, dropping his chopsticks. "The gods released me," I said, leaning forward and ignoring the general's hand pinching my thigh under the silk tablecloth. "They told me it would be a sin to let a guest remain so misinformed. You see, envoy, the saltiness you taste isn't from a blacksmith's apron. It's actually a rare mineral from the Iron Peaks. It's said to improve the cognitive functions, which, judging by your inability to realize that you've been eating with your mouth open for 20 minutes, I thought you might desperately need." The table went so quiet, I could hear the general's pulse through the air between us. You dare?" Chow stammered, his mustache quivering. "And the smell," I continued, on a roll now. "That's not crude north air. That's the scent of men who actually fight for a living, rather than men who spend their days debating the proper length of a silk tassel. If the scent bothers you, I have some jasmine oil in my chambers, though I fear it might clash with your aroma of desperate ambition." Envoy Chow turned the color of an overripe plum. He looked at Feng Wei, expecting a swift execution. "General, your wife is correct," Feng Wei said that I blinked. I had expected a lecture, a sack, possibly silk, or at least a stern shushing. Instead, the general reached for his wine cup, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "She is a bit loud," Feng Wei said to the trembling envoy, "but her assessment of the salt is accurate. It is very good for the brain. Perhaps you should have a second bowl." The rest of the dinner was conducted in a very different kind of silence. The kind where Envoy Chow ate his soup as fast as humanly possible and retreated to his carriage before the moon was full. Later, in the privacy of our chambers, I waited for the explosion. Feng Wei stood by the window, his back to me. "Are you going to put me in the sack now?" I asked, picking at a loose thread on my sleeve that he turned around. He wasn't scowling. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were burning with a terrifying magnetic intensity. He walked toward me until I was backed against the bedpost. "You humiliated an imperial envoy," he whispered, his hands coming up to rest on the wood on either side of my head. "He was an ass," I defended. "He insulted your home. I couldn't just sit there and let him bird's nest us to death." Feng Wei leaned down, his forehead brushing mine. "No one has ever defended my honor with words before, Xiaolan. They usually use shields. It was efficient." "Efficient?" I laughed nervously. "I almost got us exiled." "It was magnificent," he corrected, his voice dropping to that low, honey-dark growl. "But if you ever do it again, I really will buy that burlap sack." "Make it silk," I whispered, my breath catching as his hand moved to cup my jaw. "And I might consider it." Chapter 5. The summer storms in the northern peaks didn't just rain, they waged war on the earth. One moment, the general and I were inspecting the mountain outposts, me on a sturdy pony named Marshmallow, over his dead body, and him on his massive black stallion. And the next, the sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise. The wind shrieked, tearing the breath from my lungs, and before I could even voice a complaint about the ruinous effect of humidity on my hair, Feng Wei had grabbed my reins and pulled me toward a hunter's shack tucked into the lee of a granite cliff. The cabin was small, smelling of pine resin and old wood smoke. As the door slammed shut against the deluge, we were plunged into a dim, intimate grayness. The only sound was the frantic drumming of rain on the thatched roof. "Well," I said, my voice sounding unnervingly loud in the cramped space. I wrung out the hem of my travel tunic, a puddle forming at my boots. "This is cozy. If by cozy, you mean a damp box where we can listen to each other's teeth chatter. I suppose a romantic fire is out of the question? Or does the Iron Wolf just glare at logs until they ignite out of pure terror?" Feng Wei didn't answer. He was busy stripping off his heavy outer robe. The damp silk clung to his shoulders, outlining the hard, powerful curves of his back. I suddenly found I had a very dry throat. "There is dry wood in the corner," he said, his voice grittier than usual. "Strip off those wet layers, Xiaolan. You'll catch a lung fever." "Are you ordering me to undress, General? Because usually, that involves a bit more poetry and perhaps a glass of wine," I teased, though my hands were shaking as I fumbled with the sodden knots of my sash. "Besides, I have a very sturdy constitution. I once survived a winter in the capital with nothing but a thin shawl and the heat of my own indignation." "The north is not the capital." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "And you are shivering." He reached out, his large hands replacing my clumsy fingers at my waist. I went still. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thick, as if the storm outside had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. As he untied the wet silk, his knuckles grazed my skin, leaving trails of fire in their wake. "You're very quiet," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the task. "It's unsettling." "I'm calculating," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Calculating what?" "How many seconds I have left before I say something that ruins this moment. I have a talent for it, you know. I was just about to mention that your left shoulder blade is slightly higher than your right, which suggests you sleep on your side like a curled-up shrimp." Feng Wei paused. He looked up, his face inches from mine. The icy reserve he usually wore like armor was gone, melted away by the heat of the small space. "A shrimp. A very large, muscular, terrifying shrimp." I corrected breathlessly that he let out a low, rough sound, part laugh, part groan. And suddenly his hands weren't on my sash anymore. They were on my waist, pulling me flush against him. The contrast was staggering. His skin was burning hot, while mine was chilled from the rain. "You are the most infuriating woman in the Middle Kingdom," he growled, his gaze dropping to my lips. "I should have sent you back the day you insulted my cape." "You couldn't," I challenged, my hands finding purchase on his damp chest. "You were already charmed. You just didn't have the vocabulary to admit it." "I have the vocabulary for this," he whispered. He kissed me then. And it wasn't the kiss of a refined scholar or a hesitant suitor. It was the kiss of a man who had spent his life behind stone walls and was finally watching them crumble. It was deep, hungry, and smelled of the coming storm that I kissed him back with all the words I hadn't said, my fingers tangling in his dark hair. For once, the world was silent. There was no court, no soldiers, no debts, just the heat of him and the steady, rhythmic beat of two hearts trying to become one. When he finally pulled back, just a fraction, his forehead rested against mine. His breath was ragged. Still have something to say, Xiaolan? I blinked, my head spinning. Only that. If you kiss me like that again, I might actually run out of breath. And then we'd both be in trouble, because who would tell you that you're brooding too loudly? Feng Wei pulled me tighter, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across his face. I think I could live with the silence. For a little while. Chapter 6. The return to the Iron Wolf Fortress felt different. The stone walls didn't look quite so gray, and the wind didn't bite quite so hard. Of course, I ruined the romantic atmosphere within 10 minutes of entering the gates by loudly announcing that the general's horse, Thunder, was looking pleasantly plump and might need a corset. Feng Wei had just helped me down from the saddle, his hands lingering on my waist a second longer than strictly necessary, when a servant hurried forward, looking as though he'd seen a ghost. General, the boy stammered, bowing so low his forehead nearly hit the dirt. A guest has arrived. She is waiting in the inner pavilion. The air around Feng Wei instantly turned to ice. We entered the pavilion to find a woman who looked like she had been painted by a master artist using only the finest silk and moonlight. She was Lady Hanbing, the daughter of a powerful northern duke. She sat with a grace that made my own posture look like a sack of falling potatoes. Wei Gij, she purred, rising to her feet. Her voice was like honey dripping over a sharp blade. It has been too long. I heard you had married a scholar's daughter. I came to see if the rumors of your domesticity were true. I felt the general's muscles lock beside me. Wei Gij. Big brother Wei? I felt a sudden, violent urge to see if her perfect hair stayed in place if I threw a bowl of soup at it. Lady Han, Feng Wei said, his voice a flat, military monotone. This is my wife Lin Xiaolan. Hanbing turned her gaze to me. Her eyes traveled from my wind-blown hair down to my mud-splattered boots. Ah, delightful. She certainly has a sturdy quality, like a mountain pony. My mouth opened before my brain could even reach for the reins. And you, Lady Han, have a wonderful quality too. You're like a porcelain vase. Very pretty, very expensive, and I imagine if someone bumped into you, you'd shatter into 1,000 useless little pieces. It's a miracle you survived the carriage ride without cracking. Hanbing's smile didn't falter, but her eyes flashed with venom. I see the rumors of your tongue were understated. Wait, surely you find this noise exhausting? You always preferred the quiet of the snow. I felt a twinge of insecurity, a rare and loathsome feeling. She knew him. She knew his past. I was just the girl who had been traded for a gambling debt. Feng Wei stepped forward, but instead of moving toward her, he stepped closer to me. The snow is cold, Hanbing. And quiet is often just another word for lonely. I find I have grown fond of the noise. Fond. Hanbing laughed, a tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. You are a lion, Wei. You don't keep a magpie as a mate. You need someone who understands the weight of your sword. Someone who can stand in silence by your side at the imperial court. Oh, please, I interjected, stepping around the general to face her. The imperial court is basically a giant room full of overdressed people waiting for someone to trip. If I stand there in silence, people will think I'm boring. And if there's one thing the Iron Wolf doesn't need, it's a wife who makes him look like he's attending a funeral. Besides, General, didn't you say my noise was efficient? Or was that just the mountain air talking? Feng Wei looked down at me. The corner of his mouth did that wonderful, tiny twitch. It was the truth. He then looked at Hanbing, his expression hardening. Lady Han, there are rooms prepared for you in the guest wing. We shall see you at dinner. I suggest you spend the afternoon resting. The North has a way of wearing out those who aren't sturdy. As he led me away, I waited until we were out of earshot before I leaned in. Wei Gij. Really? If I ever call you that, please smothered me with a silk pillow. It's nauseating. I hated it when we were children, he admitted, his voice low. And I hate it more now. Good, I said, patting his arm. Because if she bats her eyelashes at you one more time, I'm going to tell her that her eyeliner is lopsided. It'll haunt her for a week. Feng Wei caught my hand, pulling me to a stop in the shadowed corridor. Are you jealous, Xiaolan? I am not jealous. I lied, my chin tilted high. I am merely protective of my investment. I spend a lot of energy insulting you into liking me. I'm not letting some porcelain doll steal my hard work. He laughed, a real, chest-deep sound, and kissed my forehead. The doll wouldn't stand a chance against the magpie. Chapter 7. The dining hall was a battlefield of a different sort that evening. Lady Hanbing had changed into a gown of silver-white silk that shimmered like frost, making me feel like a very loud splash of crimson in my favorite embroidered robes. She sat to the general's left, her movements as fluid and silent as a predatory cat. Weigage, she began, her voice carrying that practiced melodic lilt. I brought some specialized tea from the capital. It's a blend meant to soothe the nerves of those who find themselves in harsh environments. She spared a pointed glance at me. I thought your household might benefit from a little refinement. I reached for a chicken leg, snapping a bone with perhaps more force than necessary. How thoughtful. We were just saying the fortress smelled too much like honor and hard work. A bit of perfumed water is exactly what we need to distract us from our sturdy reality. Hanbing's eyes narrowed as her personal maid stepped forward to pour the tea into 3 jade cups. It is an acquired taste, Lady Lin. Very delicate. One must have a sophisticated palate to truly appreciate it. Feng Wei reached for his cup, his mind clearly on the border reports he had been reading all afternoon. His hand closed around the jade, lifting it toward his lips. That I looked at the tea. It was a beautiful, pale amber, but as the steam rose, a tiny metallic scent pricked at the back of my nose. It was subtle, buried under the fragrance of dried chrysanthemums. But my father, for all his gambling faults, had been a scholar of botany. He had taught me that certain medicinal roots from the south smelled like wet copper when heated. General, stop. I blurted out. Feng Wei's hand froze midair. The entire room went silent. Hanbing's expression didn't change, but her fingers gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. Xiaolan, Feng Wei asked, his brow furrowing. Is there a fly in my cup, or are you just practicing your shouting for the morning drills? Don't drink it, I said, my voice uncharacteristically steady. I stood up and walked around the table, taking the cup from his hand. The sophisticated palate, Lady Han mentioned? Mine is apparently very sensitive to things that smell like zhuling root, which is lovely for kidney ailments, but in high doses, it tends to make one's heart stop beating entirely. A bit too soothing. Wouldn't you say? Hanbing gasped, her hand flying to her throat. What are you implying? That I would bring poison into the general's home? Wei, surely you won't allow this common slander. Feng Wei didn't look at Hanbing. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. Are you sure? Give it to the cat, I suggested, pointing to the stray tabby that lived in the kitchens. Actually, don't. I like the cat. Give it to your master-at-arms' favorite houseplant. If it's dead by morning, I'm right. If not, I'll spend a week in the Silence Vow corner and eat nothing but plain rice. This is an outrage. Hanbing cried, standing up. I have been a friend of the Feng family since I could walk. And yet, I said, stepping closer to her, the jade cup still in my hand. You walk like someone who has a lot to gain from a widowed general, who needs a refined second wife to manage his mourning. If the tea is so safe, Lady Han, why don't you swap with the general? It would be a shame to let such a delicate blend go to waste. I held the cup out to her. Her eyes darted from the tea to Feng Wei, whose expression had shifted from confusion to a cold, terrifying stillness. The air in the room became heavy, the iron wolf finally emerging from behind the husband. Drink it, Binger, Feng Wei said. The use of the childhood nickname was not affectionate. It sounded like a death sentence. Hanbing turned ashen. She looked at the cup, then suddenly struck out with her hand, sending the jade flying. It shattered against the stone floor, the amber liquid hissing into the cracks. Before she could bolt, Feng Wei's hand was a vice around her wrist. Guards, he commanded, his voice vibrating with a rage that made the lanterns flicker. Escort Lady Han to the dungeon. She will stay there until the imperial magistrates arrive to discuss the definition of refined tea. As they dragged a screaming Hanbing away, the hall fell into a stunned hush. Feng Wei stood there for a long time, his back to me. I felt the adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by a sudden, shaky exhaustion. Well, I whispered, trying to reclaim my usual tone. I suppose that means I don't have to go to the silence vow corner. Though honestly, I've had so much to say today I might have enjoyed the nap. Feng Wei turned around. He strode toward me, and for a second, I thought he might be angry that I'd caused such a scene. Instead, he grabbed my face in both of his hands and kissed me with a desperate, crushing intensity. You saved my life, he breathed against my lips, his forehead resting against mine. I saved my meal ticket, I joked, though my voice cracked. Who else is going to buy me silk sacks to be put in? He pulled me into a tight embrace, his heart thundering against mine. You are not a magpie, Xiaolan. You are a phoenix. And I am a fool for ever wanting you to be quiet. Does this mean I get a bigger jewelry allowance? I asked into his chest. It means, he whispered. You get whatever you want. Just keep talking. Chapter 8. The news of Lady Hanbing's treachery had barely cooled like yesterday's kanji, before a new headache arrived at the fortress gates. This time, it wasn't a silk-clad snake, but a mountain of a man named Warlord Kassar. He was a border chieftain from the western steppes, a man who believed that diplomacy was something you did with a mace, and that women were meant to be seen, and never, ever heard that he arrived with 50 riders and a demand to discuss territorial boundaries. Though it was obvious he was really there to see if the rumors were true, that the great General Feng Wei had been domesticated by a woman who wouldn't stop chirping. I hear the Iron Wolf has found a canary. Kassar boomed as he strode into the great hall, his boots caked in frozen mud. He smelled of goat milk and unwashed ambition. He looked at me, sitting beside Feng Wei, and let out a bark of laughter. A pretty thing, but small. Does she know how to do anything other than look decorative? Or do you have to wind her up to get her to speak? I felt Feng Wei's hand tighten on the arm of his chair, his knuckles turning the color of bone. He was in his diplomatic mode, which usually meant he looked like he was contemplating a massacre while saying nothing. The Lady Lin Xiaolan is my wife, Kassar, Feng Wei said, his voice a low, dangerous warning. She is not a canary. No, I'm more of a bird of prey, I interjected, leaning forward and ignoring the general's subtle shut up nudge with his knee. Though I can see why you're confused. From where you're standing, anyone with a full set of teeth and a basic grasp of grammar must seem like a different species. Is that mud on your cloak, Lord Kassar? Or is your horse simply expressing its opinion of your leadership? Kassar's laughter died mid-throat. He blinked, his thick brows knitting together. You speak to me? A woman speaks in a council of war. I'm sorry, I didn't realize this was a council of war, I said, tilting my head. I thought it was a gathering for people with questionable hygiene habits. If we're talking about war, perhaps we should discuss why your men are currently camped 3 miles into the imperial territory. Is it because you can't read a map? Or is it that your eyesight is failing along with your manners? Kassar slammed a fist onto the table, rattling the teacups. General, you allow this? In my lands, a woman who spoke such insolence would have her tongue trimmed. Feng Wei stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply leaned over the table, his shadow looming over the warlord until the larger man actually took a half-step back. In your lands, Kassar, you are lucky to survive the winter, Feng Wei said, his voice cold enough to crack stone. In my lands, my wife says what she pleases. And if you find her words sharp, I suggest you develop thicker skin. Or perhaps, as she suggests, better hygiene. It would certainly make this negotiation more tolerable. This is an insult, Kassar roared. I came to offer a pact, but I will not be mocked by a girl. A girl? I laughed, standing up to join my husband. I felt the heat of Feng Wei's presence behind me, a solid wall of support. Lord Kassar, if I were a girl, I'd be crying. Instead, I'm wondering if you brought those 50 riders because you're afraid of the dark, or because you need help counting to 10. If you want a pact, sign the scroll and leave. If you want to fight, I'm sure the general can find a moment between my chirping to show you why they call him the Iron Wolf. Kassar looked at me, then at Feng Wei, who was looking at me with a terrifyingly proud expression. The warlord realized then that he wasn't dealing with a weakened general. He was dealing with a man who now had a second, sharper blade, one that lived in his wife's mouth. That he snatched the scroll from the table, scribbled his mark, and turned on his heel. The North has gone mad, he muttered as he stormed out. Once the doors slammed shut, The hall fell into a brief, ringing silence. I turned to Feng Wei, my heart still racing from the sheer audacity of my own tongue. I might have overstepped that time, I admitted, looking at the door. He was very large. Feng Wei turned to me, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face, the first real smile I'd seen him give in front of the servants. He picked me up by the waist and swung me around once, his laughter echoing off the rafters. You called him illiterate, Feng Wei breathed, setting me down but keeping his hands on my hips. He's been a thorn in the Empire's side for a decade, and you made him retreat with a comment about his eyesight. I just call it as I see it, General, I said, reaching up to straighten his collar. But if he comes back with a catapult, I'm blaming you. Let him come, Feng Wei whispered, leaning down to capture my lips. As long as you're standing here to tell him his catapult is lopsided, I have nothing to fear. Chapter 9. The fortress was uncharacteristically quiet. Warlord Kassar had retreated back to the steps to presumably scrub his cloak and rethink his life choices. And for the first time in weeks, there were no spies to unmask or envoys to offend. I found Feng Wei in his study, but the maps of troop movements had been rolled up. In their place sat the weathered wooden box I had discovered weeks ago. A single candle flickered between us, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. I thought you might want to hear them, he said, his voice unusually soft. He held a yellowed scrap of parchment, as if it were made of spun glass. The poems my grandfather wrote. He always said that words are the only things that outlast the person who speaks them. I sat across from him, tucking my feet under my silk skirts. A dangerous sentiment, General. If my words outlast me, the historians are going to have a very confusing time explaining why the Iron Wolf's wife spent so much time talking about fermented socks and horse corsets. He let out a short, huffing laugh, but his eyes remained serious. He began to read. His voice, usually a command that could move battalions, transformed. It became a low, melodic baritone that echoed the rhythm of the verses. He read of the plum blossoms in spring, of the way the moonlight looks on a frozen lake, and of a longing for a peace he had never truly known. As he finished the last line, he looked up. The candle caught the sharp planes of his face, softening the scar on his cheek. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. I realized then that I wasn't just in love with a general. I was in love with the man who carried a library in his heart while he carried a sword in his hand. It's beautiful, I whispered. And you read them like you wrote them yourself. I could never write such things, he said, looking back at the box. My hands are for breaking things, Xiaolan. They are not meant for the brush. That is the biggest load of horse feathers you've ever uttered. I snapped, the habit of my tongue returning before I could stop it. You think because you have calluses you don't have a soul? You look at this land and see more than just defensive positions. You see the light on the snow. You see the people behind the walls. Don't you dare pretend to be a simple weapon just because it's easier than being a man. Feng Wei set the parchment down. He rose from his chair and walked around the desk, stopping until his knees brushed mine. He reached down, taking my hands in his. His palms were rough, a map of a decade of war, but his grip was incredibly gentle. I spent my life in silence, Xiaolan, because I thought silence was the only way to stay strong. I thought if I spoke, I would give away my weaknesses. He pulled me to my feet, his gaze locking onto mine. But then you arrived. You stepped into my life and you didn't just speak. You shouted. You laughed. You pointed out the dust on my mantle and the holes in my armor. I was being helpful, I murmured, my heart doing a frantic dance in my chest. You were being a light, he corrected. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. I realized that my greatest weakness wasn't a lack of silence. It was a lack of you. I don't just love you despite your mouth, Xiaolan. I love you because of it. It's the only thing in this world that speaks the truth to me. The humor finally failed me. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. A rare occurrence for a girl who usually talked her way out of any emotion. I leaned my head against his chest, listening to the steady, powerful thrum of his heart. You realize, I said into his silk tunic, my voice muffled, that if you say things like that, I'm going to have even more to talk about. I'll be insufferable. I'll tell everyone that the god of war is actually a romantic who likes dusty flowers. Tell them, he whispered, kissing the top of my head. Let them know that the Iron Wolf has been tamed by a magpie. I am not a magpie, I sniffled, looking up at him with a watery grin. I'm a phoenix. We discussed this. A very, very loud phoenix, he agreed, before leaning down to seal the confession with a kiss that tasted of sandalwood and promises. Chapter 10. The peace of our poetry and insults phase lasted exactly 4 days. It was shattered by the arrival of a messenger bearing a scroll sealed with the emperor's personal wax. Not the usual red, but black. Black wax meant a summons of the most dire nature. The emperor is ill, Feng Wei said, his face returning to that familiar, terrifying mask of granite. And the Grand Secretary, Lord Ma, has been named regent. He demands our immediate presence in the capital to account for the mismanagement of the northern borders. I snorted, throwing a pair of silk slippers into a travel chest. Mismanagement? You've practically turned the border into a library and a tea house. If Lord Ma thinks peace is mismanagement, he's probably just upset he hasn't had a chance to sell any new war bonds. That man has a face like a shriveled plum and a soul to match. Xiulan, this is serious, Feng Wei said, catching my wrist. Ma was Lady Han Bing's uncle. He doesn't want an account of the borders. He wants our heads for the humiliation of his niece and the loss of his influence in the north. The journey to the capital was devoid of my usual banter. I watched the general's profile as we rode through the gates of the Forbidden City. He looked like a man walking toward his own execution, his hand perpetually hovering over the hilt of his guandao. The throne room was a cavern of gold and shadow. Lord Ma stood on the dais, draped in robes so heavy with gold thread he looked like a walking treasury. Beside him, the young prince sat looking terrified, while the emperor was nowhere to be seen. General Feng Wei. Lord Ma's voice echoed, thin and reedy. You stand accused of high treason. You have consorted with border warlords, ignored imperial decrees, and allowed your wife to insult the dignity of the emperor's envoys. The dignity of the envoy was a very small target, Lord Ma, I chirped, stepping out from behind Feng Wei. I felt the general's sharp intake of breath, but I didn't stop. It's hard not to hit something that small when it's waving itself in your face. As for the warlords, if the general hadn't consorted with them, they'd currently be using your fine silk tapestries as horse blankets. You're welcome, by the way. The court gasped. Lord Ma's eyes turned into 2 hateful slits. Your insolence will not save your husband, woman. Guards, seize them both. The general has grown soft in the north. Perhaps a stay in the Iron Pagoda will remind him of his duty. Soft, I laughed, though my knees were knocking together under my skirts. I walked toward the dais, ignoring the spears leveled at my throat. Lord Ma, you call it soft because he didn't bring you the bloody heads of 10,000 peasants. You want a war because you own the iron mines. You don't care about the empire. You care about the price of ore. And if you think the general is the traitor, why is it that your personal seal was found on the supply manifests that sold rotten grain to the northern garrisons? That was a bluff. A massive, terrifying, I hope the ancestors are listening, bluff. I had seen some discrepancy in the ledgers back at the fortress, but I hadn't been sure, until I saw the blood drain from Lord Ma's face. Slander, he shrieked. Pure slander from a woman who cannot hold her tongue. It's not slander if it's written in ink, you wrinkled old raisin. I shouted back. And if you arrest us, my father's scholars will release the copies to every province in the Middle Kingdom by tomorrow morning. You'll be the first regent in history to be lynched by his own tax collectors. Feng Wei stepped forward, his presence suddenly filling the room like a physical weight. He saw the opening I had carved with my big, beautiful mouth. He drew his sword, not to strike, but to point it directly at Ma's shaking chest. The lady has spoken, Feng Wei rumbled, his voice like thunder. Will you test her memory, Ma? Or shall we discuss the mismanagement of the imperial treasury instead? The guards hesitated. They looked at the general, then at the terrified regent, then at me, the girl who was currently sticking her tongue out at the most powerful man in the room. Ma stammered. He's thinking, I whispered loudly to the court. It's a slow process, give him a minute. His brain is as rusty as the grain he sold the army. Chapter 11. The bluff had bought us a temporary reprieve, but the air in the capital was thick with the scent of ozone before a storm. We were confined to the general's old manor in the city, a place of echoing marble and bitter memories. Lord Ma was a cornered rat, and cornered rats don't wait for a fair trial. They bite in the dark. You are a lunatic, Feng Wei said that night. He was pacing our bedchamber, his shadow stretching across the silk-covered walls. You accused the regent of the empire of treason based on a hunch and a prayer. If he hadn't flinched, we would be in the pits right now. He did flinch though, I said, sitting on the edge of the bed and unpinning the heavy gold ornaments from my hair. My scalp ached, but my heart was still racing. He flinched because men like him assume everyone else is as crooked as they are. Besides, Wei, your scowl did 50% of the work. I just provided the soundtrack. Xiaolan, he stopped, kneeling before me and taking my hands. His face was etched with a rare, raw fear. I cannot protect you from a knife in the dark. My sword is for armies. My strength is for battlefields. But here? In this nest of vipers? Your mouth is a target. Then I'll just have to make sure I'm a moving target, I whispered, leaning down to press my forehead against his. And you should know by now, I'm very hard to shut up. The silence that followed was broken not by a word, but by the faint, rhythmic thrum of a bowstring from the courtyard below. Feng Wei didn't think, he moved. In one fluid motion, he tackled me off the bed just as a silver-tipped arrow hissed through the air, thudding into the headboard exactly where my throat had been a second before. Stay down, he commanded, his voice dropping into the cold, flat tone of the god of war. 3 shadows vaulted through the window, their black silk garments blending into the gloom. They weren't soldiers, they were assassins from the Shadow Guild, silent and lethal. Feng Wei met the first one midair, his bare hands catching the man's throat with a sickening crack. But there were more. A fourth assassin emerged from the closet, a thin silver needle, poisoned, no doubt, glinting in his hand as he lunged toward my exposed back. Look out, you overgrown bat! I shrieked, grabbing a heavy ceramic vase from the bedside table, and hurling it with the precision of a woman who had spent years throwing things at her brothers. The vase shattered against the assassin's head. He stumbled, the needle flying wide. Is that the best you've got? I yelled, scrambling toward the hearth and grabbing a heavy iron poker. I've been insulted by the Duke of Qin, and survived a wedding to a man who eats rocks for breakfast. You think a little stick is going to scare me? Your footwork is terrible. You move like a drunken duck. The assassin, momentarily stunned by the sheer volume of my voice and the absurdity of my insults, hesitated. It was all the time Feng Wei needed. He spun away from his current opponent and delivered a kick that sent the duck through the paper screen door and into the hallway. Within minutes, the room was a wreckage of silk and blood, and the assassins lay dead or unconscious. Feng Wei stood in the center of the chaos, his chest heaving, his hands stained red. He looked at me, still clutching the iron poker, my hair a wild nest around my face. A drunken duck? He panted, a hysterical edge to his voice. He was. I snapped, my adrenaline finally boiling over into a shaky laugh. And the other one, the one you threw out the window, he had a very crooked nose. I was going to tell him his mother must have been a pug, but you killed him before I could get the words out. You really need to work on your timing, General. Feng Wei stared at me for a long beat. Then he began to laugh. It wasn't his usual huff. It was a deep, soul-clearing roar that filled the room. He stepped over a body and pulled me into his arms, squeezing me so tight I thought my ribs might actually crack this time. You talked an assassin into a state of confusion. He breathed into my hair. You are the most dangerous weapon in my arsenal, Xiaolan. I told you, I said, dropping the poker and wrapping my arms around his neck. The siege ends when the gates are broken. And I've got a lot of breath left. Chapter 11. The bluff had bought us a temporary reprieve, but the air in the capital was thick with the scent of ozone before a storm. We were confined to the general's old manor in the city, a place of echoing marble and bitter memories. Lord Ma was a cornered rat, and cornered rats don't wait for a fair trial. They bite in the dark. You are a lunatic, Feng Wei said that night. He was pacing our bedchamber, his shadow stretching across the silk-covered walls. You accused the regent of the empire of treason based on a hunch and a prayer. If he hadn't flinched, we would be in the pits right now. He did flinch though, I said, sitting on the edge of the bed and unpinning the heavy gold ornaments from my hair. My scalp ached, but my heart was still racing. He flinched because men like him assume everyone else is as crooked as they are. Besides, Wei, your scowl did 50% of the work. I just provided the soundtrack. Xiaolan, he stopped, kneeling before me and taking my hands. His face was etched with a rare, raw fear. I cannot protect you from a knife in the dark. My sword is for armies. My strength is for battlefields. But here? In this nest of vipers? Your mouth is a target. Then I'll just have to make sure I'm a moving target, I whispered, leaning down to press my forehead against his. And you should know by now, I'm very hard to shut up. The silence that followed was broken not by a word, but by the faint, rhythmic thrum of a bowstring from the courtyard below. Feng Wei didn't think, he moved. In one fluid motion, he tackled me off the bed just as a silver-tipped arrow hissed through the air, thudding into the headboard exactly where my throat had been a second before. Stay down, he commanded, his voice dropping into the cold, flat tone of the god of war. 3 shadows vaulted through the window, their black silk garments blending into the gloom. They weren't soldiers. They were assassins from the Shadow Guild, silent and lethal. Feng Wei met the first one mid-air, his bare hands catching the man's throat with a sickening crack. But there were more. A fourth assassin emerged from the closet, a thin silver needle, poisoned no doubt, glinting in his hand as he lunged toward my exposed back. Look out, you overgrown bat! I shrieked, grabbing a heavy ceramic vase from the bedside table and hurling it with the precision of a woman who had spent years throwing things at her brothers. The vase shattered against the assassin's head. He stumbled, the needle flying wide. Is that the best you've got? I yelled, scrambling toward the hearth and grabbing a heavy iron poker. I've been insulted by the Duke of Qin and survived a wedding to a man who eats rocks for breakfast. You think a little stick is going to scare me? Your footwork is terrible. You move like a drunken duck. The assassin, momentarily stunned by the sheer volume of my voice and the absurdity of my insults, hesitated. It was all the time Feng Wei needed. He spun away from his current opponent and delivered a kick that sent the duck through the paper screen door and into the hallway. Within minutes, the room was a wreckage of silk and blood, and the assassins lay dead or unconscious. Feng Wei stood in the center of the chaos, his chest heaving, his hands stained red. He looked at me, still clutching the iron poker, my hair a wild nest around my face. A drunken duck? He panted, a hysterical edge to his voice. He was. I snapped, my adrenaline finally boiling over into a shaky laugh. And the other one, the one you threw out the window, he had a very crooked nose. I was going to tell him his mother must have been a pug, but you killed him before I could get the words out. You really need to work on your timing, General. Feng Wei stared at me for a long beat. Then he began to laugh. It wasn't his usual huff. It was a deep, soul-clearing roar that filled the room. He stepped over a body and pulled me into his arms, squeezing me so tight I thought my ribs might actually crack this time. You talked an assassin into a state of confusion. He breathed into my hair. You are the most dangerous weapon in my arsenal, Xiaolan. I told you, I said, dropping the poker and wrapping my arms around his neck. The siege ends when the gates are broken. And I've got a lot of breath left. Chapter 12. The final dawn at the Forbidden City arrived with the grim beauty of a blood-orange sun. Lord Ma had mobilized the city guard, surrounding our manor under the guise of protecting the crown from northern rebels. He was desperate now. The silver needle had failed, and the rumors I had planted about the grain manifests were spreading through the marketplace like wildfire. We cannot fight our way to the palace, Feng Wei said, strapping on his black iron breastplate. The city guard outnumbers us 20 to 1. If I draw my blade against them, I am the traitor Ma claims I am. Then don't draw your blade, I said, adjusting my most flamboyant phoenix crown. I looked at my reflection, pale, terrified, but with a jaw set like a soldier's. Draw your lungs. We aren't going to fight them, Wei. We're going to talk to them. Or rather, I am. You just need to look like you're ready to kill anyone who interrupts me. We walked out of the manor gates alone. A wall of spears met us, held by young men whose eyes were wide with fear. They knew the Iron Wolf. They didn't want to die today. Step aside, I shouted, my voice echoing off the stone walls of the narrow street. I am Lady Lin Xiaolan, wife of General Feng Wei, and I am heading to the palace to deliver a message to the Son of Heaven. If you want to stop me, you'd better be prepared to explain to your mothers why you died for a man who sells rotten rice to the boys in the barracks. The spears wavered. I walked straight up to the captain of the guard, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Captain, I said, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that nonetheless carried to the back of the line. Lord Ma is currently packing his gold. When the emperor wakes up, And he is waking up. I sent a special herbalist in a laundry basket this morning. Who do you think he's going to execute first? The regent who poisoned him? Or the soldiers who blocked the general's path? The emperor is awake? The captain stammered. Wide awake and very cranky. I lied with the confidence of a goddess. He asked for a bowl of congee and the head of a traitor. I'd suggest you make sure it isn't yours. The sea of spears parted. Fear of the general was great. But fear of a resurrected emperor, and a woman who seemed to know everything, was greater. That we reached the great hall just as Lord Ma was preparing to declare the emperor deceased, and himself protector of the realm. The doors burst open with a crash that sent the officials scattering. Stop! I yelled, my voice ringing through the vaulted chamber. Lord Ma, you have a bit of soot on your nose. Is that from burning the evidence of your treason? Or did you just trip over your own lies on the way to the throne? Lord Ma spun around, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Guards! Kill them! They have committed sacrilege. The only sacrilege here is your tailoring, Lord Ma, I said, stepping into the center of the hall as Feng Wei stood behind me, his hand on the hilt of his guandao, a silent, looming threat. And the fact that you thought you could silence the North with a handful of silver needles. My husband has bled for this empire, while you've only bled it dry. Your time is up. At that moment, the silk curtains behind the throne parted. A frail, trembling figure leaned on the arm of a loyal eunuch. The emperor. He wasn't fully recovered, but he was alive, and his eyes were sharp with the clarity of a man who had nearly touched the yellow springs. Ma, the emperor croaked. The hall went deathly silent. The woman speaks the truth. My tea was bitter. The regent collapsed to his knees, his golden robes bunching around him like a pile of autumn leaves. The guards he had paid so much to command moved in, but they weren't looking at him for orders anymore. They were looking at Feng Wei. The general stepped forward, sinking to one knee before his sovereign. The North stands with the dragon, your majesty. And the North's wife, the emperor added, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, evidently stands with everyone's business. Rise, general, and take your spirited lady home. My ears need a rest. As we walked out of the palace, the sun finally hitting our faces, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't realized I was carrying. We're alive, I whispered, leaning against Feng Wei's armored arm. We are, he said, looking down at me. The Iron Wolf looked younger, the shadows gone from his eyes. And I believe I owe you a bigger jewelry allowance. And perhaps a very large, very quiet garden. A garden? I laughed, my voice returning to its full melodic strength. Don't be ridiculous, Wei. How am I supposed to hear myself talk in a garden? I want a balcony overlooking the main square. I have a lot of thoughts on the new city architecture, and I think the people deserve to hear them. Feng Wei groaned, but he pulled me close, his laughter mingling with mine. Heaven help the empire. The war is over, but the commentary has just begun. Epilogue. 1 year later, the northern border was no longer a place where joy went to die. It had, according to the local governor's latest report, become the loudest province in the Middle Kingdom. I sat on the wide, sun-drenched balcony of our newly renovated manor, which now featured teal banners and far fewer weapons on the walls, watching the morning drills. Below, the soldiers were no longer moving in grim, silent lines. They were laughing. Captain Zhao. I yelled over the railing, cupping my hands around my mouth. Your footwork is still reminiscent of a newborn giraffe on ice. If you don't tuck your chin, I'm going to make you wear a bell so the enemy can find you more easily. The captain looked up, grinned, and snapped into a perfect defensive stance. He had learned, as the entire garrison had, that my insults were actually a form of affection. Or at least, a very loud form of coaching. A pair of strong, familiar arms wrapped around my waist from behind. The scent of sandalwood and home enveloped me. Feng Wei leaned his chin on my shoulder, his dark hair brushing against my cheek. Must you torment the boy every morning, Xiaolan? He murmured, his voice no longer a growl, but a warm, low rumble. He's actually become the finest swordsman in the division. I think he's trying to get better just so you'll stop comparing him to long-necked animals. It's a proven psychological tactic, I said, leaning back into his chest. If he can survive my tongue, he can survive a barbarian invasion. By the way, your armor is clanking again. Did you lose a rivet? Or are you just trying to announce your arrival to the entire province? It's very look at me, I'm the god of war. A bit dramatic, don't you think? Feng Wei let out a soft laugh and turned me in his arms. He looked at me with a gaze so steady and filled with light that it still made my breath catch, even after a year of waking up next to him. I am dramatic, he asked, raising an eyebrow. I am not the one who ordered the kitchen staff to sing the song of the plum blossom every time the congee is served because you thought the breakfast was too emotionally stunted. The congee tastes better when the cook is in a good mood, I defended, poking his chest. And you haven't complained once. In fact, I saw you humming yesterday. It was terrifying. You sounded like a bumblebee with a bass voice. I was happy, he said simply. He took my hand, his thumb tracing the gold wedding band on my finger. A year ago, everyone told me I would be burying a wife because she couldn't hold her mouth. They said a general needs a silent house to find his peace. And? I asked, tilting my head. And they were wrong, he whispered, leaning down until our noses touched. I found my peace in the noise. I found my strength in your voice. Every time you speak, you remind me that I am a man who is loved, not just a weapon to be used. I felt a rare lump in my throat, one that even I couldn't talk my way around. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer. Well, I said, my voice a little shaky, I hope you're ready for another 50 years of it. Because I've been thinking about the way you fold your socks, Wei. It's very inefficient. We're going to need to have a long, detailed discussion about it tonight. Probably several discussions. With diagrams. Feng Wei smiled, a full, brilliant smile that reached his eyes. He didn't tell me to be quiet. He didn't reach for a silk sack. He simply captured my lips in a kiss that silenced me in the only way he knew how to. As we stood there on the balcony, the sun rising over a peaceful frontier, I realized that I hadn't just married a feared general. I had married a man who was brave enough to listen. The god of war and the phoenix with the big mouth. It wasn't the quietest love story ever told, but as the general pulled me closer and the fortress below erupted into the happy chaos of the day, I knew it was the only one worth telling. I love you, Xiulan, he whispered against my ear. I know, I replied, a mischievous glint returning to my eyes. But you said it a bit too quickly. Let's try it again with more feeling. And maybe a bit more poetry? I have some thoughts on the meter. He just laughed and kissed me again. It was going to be a very long, very loud, and very wonderful life.
Thank you for listening to the story. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more chaotic moments and unexpected twists. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.